got a very special guest. My new friend Matt Hatton and I have been talking. He's in the UK, and will explain his background and give an intro. But just as a quick refresher, we are having these conversations with industry leaders and thought leaders to keep the conversation going. As most of you know by now, the MIT Connected Things Conference normally runs at the Media Lab, the MIT Media Lab, in the springtime. Because of COVID, it was postponed to September and then finally canceled. We hope to have some good news about this, depending on what goes on with the pandemic in the springtime. But in the interim, we're going to have great conversations like the one that I believe we're about to have. So Matt's now a new friend. I've regaled him with all of my wonderful stories about my illustrious movie career and experience with Ricky Gervais, which if anybody wants to explore that with me, don't bother. I was just an extra in a movie. But I want to introduce Matt Hatton and have him give a little bit of his background to you. Matt, thanks for doing this.
Yeah, my pleasure, Mark. Pleasure to be here and glad I can get involved, really. A bit of background on me, yeah.
Yes.
I am a founding partner at Transforma Insights. We're a technology research consulting firm. Think of a very, very small version of Gartner. And Gartner's an interesting company to raise because prior to the current company, I was running a company called Makina Research, which I started in 2011 and then sold to Gartner in 2016. We're focused on IoT. I like to think, the preeminent analyst firm in the IoT space, and Gartner seemed to think so too. So they hoovered us up, and I did my time there for a couple of years, and then I'm back with the new venture.
Well, I would validate that Makina Research was the gold standard during that time period. I didn't mention in our intro, I was at Vodafone for a bit here in the States, of course, but I was on the IoT side of things. So there was literally only one vendor of research that we looked at, and it was you. I mean, the numbers were reliable. You could see what you guys were writing, and I think that's true of Transforma now, and see it on the ground. So that was helpful, because I think there's a lot of market research firms that have a point of view or an agenda that they're trying to push, whatever it is. And I think you guys are pretty objective. Also, You covered the CSP or the telco market quite a bit.
We did, and part of the reason for that is I'm at heart a telco guy, right? So my master's degree was telecommunications. I was a telecoms analyst before I was really an IoT analyst. And when you've got that kind of a background, the obvious people to go talk to when you're setting up a research firm looking at IoT is to go talk to the telco guys and the telco vendors, the people like Ericsson and Cisco and so on, who we knew pretty well when we got going. And so it was always a natural overlap kind of an area for us, was the telco IoT space to look at. And I think it's also an interesting element of it, which is about being involved, right? Not necessarily just being an observer as an analyst, but also getting stuck in and getting involved. And we like to think that we did that. There wasn't an event that was on it that we weren't speaking at or
That's
moderating, right, or hosting something or in some way involved with. We're also members of the Industrial Internet Consortium, and we were back in the Makina Research days as well. And so we like to get involved in that kind of stuff. And it always felt like we were trying to be part of the industry, as well as sitting on the outside and commenting on and reviewing. Yeah, and I feel that's important to do. And also having all that face time with people. It's all very well getting official briefings, but there's nothing quite beats having just regular interaction with people that's in a much more kind of a casual way, where you exchange information and you share knowledge, and it's all very a quid pro quo, without being a formal way, but you get to share expertise and share knowledge and share what's going on in the industry. And we always felt that worked much better than any other model we've seen.
Is that part of the model to provide some consulting engagements as a result of things?
It is, well, two ways that we...
Speaking specifically about Transforma.
Yeah, well, let's talk about that now, because everything else is water under the bridge. So should we
Yes.
say? But the way things work now, predominantly what we do, it's multi-client. Okay, so we write reports and we do the forecasts, and we've got some databases, and a company would subscribe, or an individual would subscribe, and they get access to all that good stuff, including access to us as analysts. One of the things that we like to prioritize is analyst inquiry. So unlimited inquiry, maximum an hour. Don't send us a business model for thorough review and working over, but an hour's worth of inquiry, absolutely fine. So that's one aspect of it. And the other aspect is we do client-specific work as well. So that could be anything from white papers and webinars, which is the more sort of marketing end of the spectrum, all the way through to strategy reviews. So those things that I said that we don't do as part of the client inquiry, we do them as separate projects. And that could be for anyone and doing anything. It's sometimes it's quantitative. We want to understand what the market opportunity is for us in X, and sometimes it's much more qualitative. What does our strategy look like? How does it compare to our competitors? What should we be doing as an enterprise to adopt various different IoT technologies? What's the best practice? What's the low-hanging fruit for us in terms of what we should be going after? That kind of thing.
So a couple quick things. Number one, the Industrial Internet Consortium has been a new partner of ours. So I did I think in May I did something with Stephen, their CTO, quite interesting. And they have an interesting set of tools that they offer enterprises. So kind of a self-assessment set of tools. I don't know. Do you find that companies are using that sort of thing where they would just, download essentially an Excel spreadsheet and start sort of the self-examination?
I think increasingly they are, and I would like to think they are. There's an element of we included discussion of it in a webinar that we did, actually. So I would point people towards webinar. I can't remember
find it on your page.
Yeah, exactly. There's a blog post about it or a press release about it somewhere on the site, where we actually talk people through. Okay, this was the thinking behind a lot of this Ignite IoT framework and some of the decision tools around how you deploy IoT. And Jim Morris, who was the other founding partner of Transforma Insights, has been heavily involved in that. Me, not so much, but Jim has been involved in that quite a lot, and runs one of the working groups within the IIC on digital transformation specifically. And yes, I think they're tremendously useful. I was sitting on a IoT London meetup call yesterday. You're familiar with the meetups. There must be a Cambridge IoT meetup or a Boston IoT meetup. There's a London one, which is pretty well attended. I mean, much better when it was in person, obviously, because there's nothing quite like FaceTime. But it's good to have the virtual version. And there was a gentleman there speaking who was from one of the big supermarkets in the UK, and he was talking about the challenges of how do you pick which of the projects you go to. And he was talking about all of these things relating to having challenges with multiple suppliers and multiple platforms, and how you prioritize projects and all of these sorts of things. And those kinds of the IIC frameworks and things like that are tremendously useful for organizing your thinking around how you do that kind of stuff. And we talk a bit about that on the webinar, particularly around how you structure it, making sure you're not reinventing the wheel every time you're doing something, which is part of the problem that this guy from the supermarket was talking about, because they seem to be implementing a new platform for every separate use case that they were finding. So I'm going to go back to that guy and say, hey, check out the IIC. You probably want to be aware of what they're doing. So I think they're tremendously useful. Yeah.
No, I couldn't agree more. I mean, there were a number of consortia. I think that's the plural. And there seems to be, because they, a few things have come together with them. They seem to be one of the last consortiums standing, or consortia standing, whatever the right phrase is. Us Americans, we don't know how to speak English properly.
You do a pretty good job.
I'm trying.
I think that they had the perspective right from the get-go, because what the idea behind it is it's a whole load of predominantly led by the suppliers. I mean, these things are always predominantly pushed by the suppliers, but the view was always razor sharp on how do we help adopters? What can we do to target adopters and show them, provide them with a set of tools, provide them with a set of frameworks for how they can best adopt IoT without going down the standards route, which starts getting pretty complicated. But what can you do up to, but not crossing over into the world of standards? I think it was a good approach, and led by some really phenomenal companies. I mean, Bosch was heavily involved, and they tend to know what they're doing in these kinds of spaces.
Yeah, it's a small group of very large companies, then a large group of very small companies, in a sense that makes it work. You know, the large companies can afford to write the check. The smaller companies need the larger companies for alliances, and it's an interesting ecosystem that they've built. For those watching this, I'll just refer you back to I think it's on the mitconnectedthings.com page. There's I think it's the second to last session I did with their CTO, Stephen Malore, which is quite good, actually. And he's quite detailed about not only this tool, but some of the trends that he's seeing. And this is something I recorded about 4 months ago in May, roughly. So let's talk about...
One other thing to just throw in there as well. There's another one as well, the Digital Twin Consortium, which has just been launched about 3 months ago, I guess, something like that. Maybe not even that. Worth checking out. So from the people who brought you the Industrial Internet Consortium, it's the Digital Twin Consortium.
Pretty soon we'll have digital triplets and all
that.
Yeah. It's an ugly thought. We did have, actually, in the same set of sessions, we had a gent from Ericsson talking about digital twin, Rob Tiffany, who's quite prolific in his postings.
The famous Rob Tiffany, yes, absolutely.
So, as I mentioned, we do these conferences, and every year there's a theme. The 2020 theme was to be, 5G, IoT, and AI. And also, I note that you have a relatively recent report. I think it's the one I'm referring to is the one on telcos, or as you call them, CSPs, in the report. Are these themes present in the engagements from the telcos you've been looking at? So this notion of, because again, I'm a telco guy. I've worked for, I worked for Vodafone, and part of my job was to manage our interaction with the company we owned here in the States that some people have heard of, called Verizon, until we sold it. So, I had an interesting view of everything going on between, the European guys, sending stuff to the States, and the guys in the States sending stuff outbound onto the Vodafone platform specifically. So I understand the connectivity element, but the vertical element and the AI element is a relatively newer theme. Is that what you've been seeing?
Well, yes and no, which is always the answer you'll get from an analyst to pretty much any question. But yes to the AI, in a way, no to the vertical, because the vertical one is an interesting one. It used to be that there was an obsession with moving up the stack. This idea, okay, if you want to make money in IoT, you move up the stack. And what you ended up with was a whole load of undifferentiated Me Too services that ended up competing with 20 or 30 other specialist companies in a field, be it security or fleet management or whatever. And it seems to have matured somewhat. So you've got some companies, some of the operators who have a real proper competitive differentiator, typically because they bought a bunch of companies in the field.
So Vodafone, Verizon are great examples.
Yeah,
in the fleet
absolutely. So Verizon in fleet, Vodafone in automotive and in industrial, and then there's a couple of other spaces. They bought an interesting company involved in mining just recently, so that's a good. Telefonica in retail, they bought a company called On the Spot. There's a few examples like that, but what seems to have fallen away is a lot of the Me Too type services, which I think is good. It demonstrates a bit more maturity, a bit more understanding of how the market dynamics actually really work. When it comes to AI, kinda. It's not in terms of the conversations that I have with people about IoT, but in terms of some of the conversations with people about networks. So this is interesting. Telcos using AI in the context of how they optimize their network for network planning, and
So
and
internal use, not external, not to B2B to B.
well, slightly external in as much as, you know, chatbots and that, and customer care and that kind of thing. But
Right.
predominantly, it's an internal thing, and that's the right way of approaching these things. Almost always, the best use of technology is internal in order to save money yourself. You know, there's no better way of increasing profitability than cutting your costs. Much easier than increasing revenue, generally speaking.
Right.
And so if they can do that, then it makes absolute sense. And I'll give you another, for instance. So Orange announced their 5-year strategic plan back in the tail end of last year, and they talked a lot about, it was a very internally focused thing, actually, and a lot of that was around AI and how they use AI internally, rather than thinking about, okay, how can Orange make money out of selling AI services? I don't think we're at that stage yet, and nobody else is really to any great extent. 5G is an interesting one. You mentioned 5G fleetingly. Yes. It's entering the lexicon of the IoT business, but I've always been of the view that the IoT, the 5G industry, or the 5G space, talks about IoT an awful lot in terms of justifications or remote surgery and autonomous vehicles and all these great
industrial things, and all that.
But the IoT space never talks about 5G, or pretty much never talks about 5G. The operators
see a little bit of an overlap.
I am too now. Yes, I agree on the industrial side of things, and particularly around private networks.
Which kind of leads me to the private networks point. So especially in Germany, I've observed there's a real move to private 5G networks. You know, Siemens has bought Spectrum. I think Bosch, Volkswagen, a number of other large industrial players. Again, primarily in Germany. I'm not sure if that's a Deutsche Telekom initiative, and we're seeing it a bit here. My friends at Vodafone, I have a number of sort of 5G private campus networks that I've seen announced. There's an auto one, there's a university one. There's, I'm kind of looking at all of these releases. How do I make sense of all of that? And again, to the average person watching this, differentiate between a private 5G network and just sort of when 5G rolls out here in the States more actively, which it is on the mobility side. What's it all mean? It's a long question. Sorry.
It's an interesting set of questions. One thing to tackle first is we've almost had two things arriving at the same time: the concept of private networks and the concept of 5G, and they've kind of been conflated. But actually, most private networks that are deployed in industrial settings and campus settings and for ports and so on are actually still LTE. You don't need the ultra low latency or the ultra high bandwidth or the reliability or whatever. But that is starting to change, and we are starting to see increasing numbers of factories. And I think almost politically, it's important that there's a 5G win for a lot of these players. And I think there is tremendous opportunity associated with particularly around low latency and factory operations and all sorts of things like that. So there's some pretty interesting use cases being manifest, but there aren't that many sites. If you tot up how many manufacturing sites or how many equivalents that there are there, it's in the thousands, tens of thousands. So it's high value, but I don't think it's not the mass market. There's not a tremendously large market.
I think it's I would agree. I think it's the early announcements of 5G deployments are the ones I'm seeing are again private deployments, and they're supplanting the old proprietary IoT networks that have been out there for 20 years. I'm not even talking about LoRa or any of the other narrowband type standards or non-standards, but there's a lot of just I've got a bunch of pumps in an oil field, and I've got a proprietary network so I can haul back some basic data.
Yeah, and it makes sense to use it, and there's people who are willing to sell it, and they want to get it shifted. So there's a market out there. Now, in terms of private networks versus the public networks that are being rolled out, well, obviously, there's a much more diverse group of people who will sell you a private network than will sell you public network capabilities, because effectively public networks, it's, pick one from 3 or 4, depending on which country you're in. But interestingly, a lot of the conversations that we have are with enterprises who say, actually, we want both. We do want the private network, but we also want to be able to, move externally because, for supply chain reasons, and you just got to, the use case doesn't generally stop at the factory gates, or in many cases doesn't stop at the factory gates. So there's an interest in doing both. There's also a bit of a glide path issue as well. So you mentioned Deutsche Telekom. Yes, they are quite forward thinking in terms of their in terms of pushing private 5G, but then so are Vodafone, so is Telefonica, so is Orange. They're all
the big guys. The top 10 guys are in that.
Yeah, but the glide path is an interesting thing where for some of them they offer, first of all, a public slice, and then gradual gradations of moving more and more private to the point where you've then got a fully private physical network on your site. Right. So it might be just in terms of that they have a better approach to getting to kind of onboarding customers onto a private 5G via a virtual private network, a network slice, than somebody who's just trying to sell a private network on its own. Possibly.
So. You mentioned 5G, also sort of a umbrella theme in a sense. I'm kind of distilling it from that. The other, and you mentioned digital transformation. I see those two phrases coming together quite a bit, not only in the trade press, but just in conversations with large vendors. So what's the relationship between digital transformation and 5G, if any, in your view? Might be nothing.
Not a lot, if I'm perfectly honest. Digital transformation is a challenging term. We use it to describe this kind of as an umbrella term for all of the various different technologies that we cover. So we're not just IoT. We're IoT plus AI plus data exchange plus blockchain plus a bunch of other things. And I'll tell you for why. Because in the last days of Makina Research, half the conversations we had were IoT plus something else.
Right.
How it interacts with these other technologies that sit around the outside. So we thought, okay, Transforma Insights, we're going to be covering all of it, and we need a term to apply to it. And digital transformation seemed to be the obvious one. Now, 5G is much more specific in terms of just a tiny piece of that. You might consider it a part of it and potentially an enabler for some of it. And there are many ways in which it has potential to be an enabler, but not possibly in the way everybody thinks. Everyone talks about 5G in the context of enabling new services, but actually, I think the biggest change is possibly in the way that it changes the application architecture and therefore changes who is likely to be selling products and services. And I explain it. With 5G, you're making the core network the slow bit rather than the access network the slow bit, just to put it in the simplest terms possible.
Right.
Which means that it makes a lot more sense to put the intelligence at the edge of the network. And if you're putting the intelligence at the edge of the network, well, then that creates an environment where Microsoft and AWS and Google all want to be at the edge of the network and want to be able to connect between their various capabilities. And then at the same time, you've got this interesting trend of virtualization where you're almost separating the hardware from the software and control layer in networks and opening that software space up to all and sundry to develop new services on it. And that's likely to be those hyperscalers to better serve the needs of their cloud to edge deployments. It makes for a very interesting market in the next few years. There's certainly a lot of changes coming, I'm sure.
Yeah, everything's being re-architected and replumbed, if you will. It's all new plumbing. One of the Boston area market research firms that I don't know if they're a competitor, but they're in the same space. Forrester refers to digital transformation as adaptive enterprise. I'm not sure if you've heard that phrase. which they seem to think is a little bit more on target. Just
yeah, I think that makes sense. I think it's well, the implication of digital transformation is, well, the use of the word digital. Well, what isn't digital these days, right?
Exactly.
I mean, it's fairly and transformation implies that you do it once and then it's done, and it's not that. It's a constant, ongoing search for the new technology, implementation of the new technology, and then realization of the benefits that technology brings you, and that's never going to end. Oh, sounds Sophia, doesn't it? It's
exactly
terrifying, but that is that's the way things go.
It's the mucking out the stables sort of.
Yes,
but
yeah, that's probably a better example. Yeah, the Augean stables. Yes, quite.
Yes, my wife's been hoping I'd get a bit of analog transformation, but that ship may have sailed.
Yeah, I know. You clockwork, new clockwork technology. It's all the rage.
So we kind of mentioned some of the technology vendors, AWS and Microsoft. If you were an enterprise, and I'm not asking you to name specific names necessarily, but just by category, if you were a large enterprise and you're jumping into this, or you're mucking out the stables and you just need a new shovel, just to really stretch that analogy.
Yeah.
Who would you trust to help you deploy? Would it be a telco? Would it be a global systems integrator? Would it be one of the vendors, the AWS's, Microsoft, IBMs of the world, or none of the above?
I think we're on. I was going to say we're on a cusp of going from absolutely needing the systems integrators and their specialist capability in customizing, because everything needs customizing, into going into a more of a products-based world where actually enterprises can go direct to an AWS or a Microsoft. Funny thing is, though, we've always been going gradually through those kinds of transformations. In IoT, back to when we talked about telemetry or telematics, even before we talked about machine to machine.
Right.
There was a much greater requirement for customization. You didn't have the platforms that we have now. You didn't have the devices and gateways that you have now. You had to build everything pretty much from the ground up. And that's gradually improved, particularly in the sort of 2010, 2015 time period, which made for a very rapid improvement in the technologies that were available. You compare 2010 to 2015, it was worlds of difference.
Oh yeah.
But the takeoff maybe didn't quite happen, because I think it takes a little while for it to bed in before it all starts to really accelerate in terms of growth. But I talk about IoT winter. AI has winters. They talk a lot about AI winters. There's one, we're on the cusp of the third one, possibly or possibly not, depending on who you talk to.
Right.
But I kind of feel like that 2015 to 2020 period was a bit of a winter. Now you saw growth and you saw adoption, and that was all pretty solid. And we've gone to, we've increased 5 or 6 fold the number of connected devices, and all that stuff is great. 2 or 3 fold probably. But in terms of technology developments, it all mostly happened in the first half of that decade, not in the second half of that decade, which is really interesting.
Well, let me interject. Again, as a guy that's been in the space on the vendor and the telco side, the one thing I've noticed, and this may feed into I don't know if it's a winter or what, or if just a vacation or holiday, the gestational cycle of an IoT deal from the time it's at Vodafone, we used to call it from the time it was a rumor to the time it actually deploys is 12 to 18 months. Yeah. So you've announced technology, I've got this stuff that I can go solve your whatever problem. Then there's a sales cycle. You've got to, come in, and that's where I think, some of the telcos have been doing a really good job of coming in, doing requirements gathering, working very, very early in the product development cycle, especially on the med tech devices, to embed connectivity and understand, what data needs to come back to the network, what data doesn't, so optimizing it and all that. But so that process is, again, 12 to 18 months in my, from my observation, just as a guy in the space. So that may contribate to the winter, or maybe the winter just gets lengthened by that year and a half time period. What do you say to that?
Well, I give you an example. The thing that springs to mind is Okay, some of the things that arrived in the IoT summer, should we call it that, between 2010 and 2015, were these low power technologies.
Right.
And the ones within 3GPP had just about arrived in 2015.
NB-IoT, CAT-M, CAT-M1.
Yeah, it kind of just arrived then. But talking to Eric Bernice at Vodafone, formerly your boss at Vodafone, I guess.
He would have been my boss's boss,
or,
but yes.
Yeah, okay. His view was if Vodafone had those technologies, 5 years previously, half of the connections on the network would have been using those technologies. So it's there is obviously a lag factor for some of these things to bed in. The concept of how they're deployed and used is always going to take a while to bed in. And not only that, I think if you constantly have all these technology developments, it's exhausting. You can't survive with it. You have to have the sort of the technology fallow periods in between, where you actually start realizing the benefits that have come along. You don't want your technologies or your generations of technologies to be arriving too soon between each other, because you never make a choice. You never make a decision to implement technology.
And that's sort of the POC, the proof of concept battle that people are fighting. I think you're right. I mean, these technologies should have a long life cycle, but they have the life cycle of a fly.
Yeah, quite. Well, I mean, the POC challenge that we've seen, POC hell, as I've talked about,
right.
is another matter. But yes, you're right. I think you need a 10-year run at a technology at least, just for certainty, right? Part of the problems that we've got at the moment. One of the funny things about the research that we've just done on the telcos in IoT is, you go back 10 years. If you activated or you wanted to connect a device somewhere around the world, you stuck a SIM in it and sent it off, and it would connect. Right? It'd be roaming, probably be a bit expensive, but it would work. Now we're back to looking at coverage maps.
Well, that's because, again, we may be getting into the weeds for non-telco people, but again, our friend Eric Bernice and a lot of the big players have looked at this notion of a global SIM. Obviously, AT&T have been quite active in that space here in the States. But now with eSIM, which again is almost a whole different talk, perhaps, you have this notion of I might turn it on and it's on Verizon, but I can convert it over. I can swap the profile. And I know in the EU, which is where a lot of that notion of giving consumer choice for SIM management, if you will, or for what telco is my car on. The consumer choice aspect, in a way, has supplanted roaming as a means to an end. And I think it's added confusion to the market personally, but
I think it has, but ultimately I think it's a tremendous benefit. Just the supply chain efficiency associated with eSIM, it can activate in any market and connect to a network there. It just saves a lot of trouble. But the funny thing is, you kind of get this wavering backwards and forwards between the local and the global. The reason for EUICC, or reason for needing eSIM, was because you had various countries and operators saying, we don't want these permanent roaming devices on our network. And then eSIM solved that. And then you start getting issues now with 2G and 3G networks being turned off in some countries. 5G is only sporadically available.
It's aspirational at this point.
Same with the LTE-M and the narrowband IoT networks. So you've got this whole patchwork of different networks that are available. Compared to 2010, every country pretty much had GSM, GPRS everywhere. And that was very easy. It didn't give you necessarily everything you needed, but it was damn easy to work out what technology you needed to put into your devices, which helped with anybody who's a developer, right?
Or hardware or software. No, I agree. So that kind of, and again, I'm just watching the clock at our end. That kind of backs me into this notion of platforms. In July, one of the other firms, IoT Analytics, declared that there were 620 publicly known IoT networks. Why?
620 IoT platforms. Platform counting is not something that we've ever been particularly interested in doing. The thing with it is, these are different things that do different things for different people.
Which begets that question. So what are, very quickly, what are the different kinds of platforms? So again, I can think from the telco and there's SIM management. Let me manage connectivity.
Yeah, so you've got that kind of connectivity management level where there's really only 3 or 4 decent sized ones and about half a dozen other ones that you might choose to use. So really they're not an amazing amount of choice or an amazing number that you need to give that much consideration to. And then the next level up is probably around device management and then application enablement. Also at those levels, there's probably slightly more at the application enablement platform. That what we're talking about there is ThingWorks or Platform. These types of companies.
Insight.
Yes.
That's more enablement.
It's more. Yeah, they get more into the sort of consulting bit of it as well. I feel, but yeah. And then you maybe got 15 or 20 different players who are relevant, and then you've got a whole load that are associated with specific companies. So Sierra Wireless has got their platform and Telid has got their platform. So there's those hardware associated ones, and then you've got millions, well certainly hundreds of vertical ones. Okay,
so that'd be SAP, Bosch, Schneider Electric.
Yeah, and even ones that I would say Fireware for smart cities, right? Now, if you're not involved in smart cities, it shouldn't ever come on your radar. And therefore, the fact that there's 620 platforms, well, you can chalk off one already, so you're down to 619. And I'm pretty confident there's another good 500 and something that you can probably also chalk off because they're not even that relevant to what you're doing. I mean, the challenge is obviously that's a scary number. Everybody looks at that and says, oh, I don't know what I'm supposed to be, who I'm supposed to be using, what I'm supposed to be doing. And actually, one of the things we're doing, Transforma Insights, we've built this case study database where we're looking at real world examples, deployments of IoT and a bunch of other technology areas as well. And one of the things we look at there is the vendors that are used. Okay, so who provides connectivity, who provides the various different platform pieces. Right. Which is quite useful because if you go in there and say, I'm a retailer and I'm thinking about doing an application in this space, you can look at who is actually being used for the various different elements. And you can see, okay, well, yeah, and you can go, okay, well, it seems like 70% of the deployments in this space are using Microsoft Azure. Probably be a sensible idea for me to go knock on their door and see what they're doing, because all of my competitors are using that. So it's a good way of kind of narrowing down that funnel. Otherwise, it becomes a bit overwhelming.
Well, and I think that's absolutely true. And I look at the AWSs and the Microsofts, and they're tools vendors that are now bringing in vertical solutions, and they're bringing I don't want to say full stack, but they're populating elements of the stack. So whether it's analytics tools or visualization tools, obviously, AWS, I've always said that one of their strategy elements is we have a commercial here on TV about the Roach Motel, that the Roach checks in, but it never checks out. The data checks in, but it never checks out in some of these cases. And that's their goal, is to manage the data on behalf of the enterprise. And then and in fact, AWS has this brilliant strategy, in my view, where they drop off. It could be a large truck, or it could be a small lunchbox sized hard disk, effectively, and it hoovers up or Dysons up all of the data that you've got.
I've never heard Dyson used as a verb before, but that's.
I was trying to be deferential to my new British friend, but they ingest all the data, and then once they've got it, they've got historical data, that sits next to current data, which I think is quite smart, not only in the IoT space, but in just general data space. So I've seen that they've taken away tremendous market share from the smaller players. Even the not so small players, the SAPs, the Siemens, the Bosches, they've now become much more targeted and verticalized, where I think they were, in the nuclear winter that you described earlier, maybe they were more generalist platforms back at that point. Does that make sense? Is that true?
It does, and I think almost the sky's the limit for AWS and Microsoft. The question is whether they want to stop. And one of the big themes of research that we're doing is looking specifically at these hyperscalers and where they're likely to want to get to. Right? What can they do with the set of tools and capabilities that they've got, and will likely build on with further acquisitions and enhancements and so on. And it's hard to escape the view that they own everything end to end, pretty much. Right. They may not own spectrum, they may not own physical network infrastructure, but more or less everything else they'll want to have a part in. And the question for the interesting ones to watch are those big players who are just sitting below them: Oracle, SAP, IBM,
right?
And what they will want to do, because they don't have this hyperscale cloud infrastructure that the others do, but they also might want a bit of that business. It's certainly an interesting one to watch how they might adapt their strategies in
and they have the financial like IBM specifically, and I've had lots of talks with folks over there. They have the financial wherewithal, and they've got Red Hat, which sits a lot in the network core, and it's quite an interesting acquisition of theirs last year, $30-some-odd billion.
Yeah, no, it certainly was, and I can anticipate that particularly the open source heritage of Red Hat plays quite well to this idea of this, open software control layer on telecoms networks that they can use to build new enterprise end user services without having proprietary. It's not about proprietary communication services. It's about a set of building blocks that someone can use to deliver an end-to-end set of enterprise services, and I think we're getting more into that space, and it's getting much more vertically integrated. Everything seems to be getting much more vertically integrated, which is quite an interesting one to watch as well.
So again, we're on the home stretch. No, I agree with everything you just said. So you have a book, and you and I discussed this. You might want to give one away, but there's a string attached. So let's discuss. First of all, what is the book, and where can one get it?
The book is The Internet of Things Myth, that I wrote with a gentleman called William Webb. He was formerly the president of the IET, and he was, interestingly, he was the CTO of a company called Newell, whose technology formed the basis for narrowband IoT. We've talked about narrowband IoT earlier. Right. Their technology formed the basis of it before they were bought by Huawei in 2014. Anyway, he's eminently more qualified to talk about IoT than I am, but somehow I managed to hitch myself to his coattails, and we wrote a book together, talking about all sorts of things to do with why we didn't hit the ambitious forecasts of 50 billion connected devices that came out in 2010. Now, some people were saying 50 billion connected devices in 2010, Ericsson and Cisco being the prime candidates. We as a company forecasting around about then, our forecasts were about a quarter of that, but actually we still didn't hit that. So
and I think you said what, 8 billion in 2019 and 24 billion?
Back in 2011, we were saying 11 billion in 2020 is what we were saying, rather than the 50 billion that 11 or 12. But we're now we will be 2020 somewhere between 8 and 9. So we're, in terms of 10-year market forecasts, I think we were pretty good.
Right.
Anyway, the idea behind the book was, what did we miss? What were some of the problems? What caused issues? And actually, you mentioned one, POCs. POC hell is how I term it. This problem of only thinking about the technical, not thinking about the commercial, not thinking about how you actually deploy IoT within the organization, right, making all the changes necessary. So that was one big one. But there's all sorts of different issues that we ran into. Some technical, some commercial, some legal, all sorts of things.
Well, it sounds like a good book. I'll go pick it up. But for people, I think we're going to give one lucky, I hate to sound really commercial here, but really tacky, but we're going to give one lucky viewer the opportunity to get a copy of it for free.
Absolutely. Well, if you want to follow us, follow Transforma. Tweet is our Twitter account, at Transforma Tweet. Follow us. And DM us with an address, and we will make a call on who the winners are on the 16th of October, pluck some lucky winners out and send them a copy of the book. So Excellent. We'd love to have people It's a naked attempt to get people to follow our Twitter account. That's entirely what it's down to. But
look, I've seen more gauche forms of pandering from others, so this one's quite good. So say it again.
Or if you just want to buy it, it's available on Amazon.
There you go. There you go. So again, the DM. What's the Twitter handle again?
It's Transforma with an A. Transforma tweet. All together. Transforma tweet.
Oh, and you can Google it. It'll probably be on the opening slide that preceded this. And for the folks that follow me at Thurman, if you need that or need to meet Matt Hatton, just send me a note and I'll pass it on to him and he can treat it however he'd like. So with that,
genuine respect and
yes,
as it deserves, I'm sure.
Yes, I'm sure anything coming from me deserves lots of respect. But I do. We ran a little long, but I think it was a great conversation. Matt, I really want to thank you for your time and your patience and your good humor today. I think we really went through a lot of very, very important topics. For those that are further interested, Transforma Insights is the preeminent, in my opinion, market research firm, especially in the IoT space, covering AI, digital transformation, and all of the themes that we've talked about. You can find them on Twitter. If you're working inside a big company, they have, I'm sure, lovely ways to sell information to you, and I'm sure they'd be happy to take you through that. And you can follow him, you can read his book, all those things we've been talking about. But Matt, thanks very much indeed for your time, and